Ministers' housing allowance is arguably the most important tax benefit available to ministers, allowing them to exclude housing expenses from their ministerial income before and after retirement. But unfortunately, it's often misunderstood and misapplied, so ministers may not receive their full benefit. So let's clarify who can claim a minister's housing allowance. Well, as you know, the minister's employment category is very unique, unlike any other internal revenue code. And according to the IRS, ministers for tax purposes must be licensed, ordained, or commissioned ministry leaders involved in direct ministry. Housing allowance is available to any minister, as recognized by the IRS, who owns a home, rents, or lives in a rent-free church-owned parsonage. So how does this work? While actively employed at a church or a church-related employer, a minister may exclude some or all of their ministerial income. And in retirement, a minister may exclude some or all of their ministerial income if a denominational pension board, such as Guidestone, designates it as housing allowance according to Revenue Ruling 75-22. Now, this is a tremendous benefit to you in retirement, but it's important to note that this only applies to distributions from ministerial income that were deferred into a church retirement plan, such as a 403B offered through Guidestone. So in other words, an individual retirement account or an IRA are not eligible for housing allowance designations. So how can you, as a minister, whether you're actively serving or retired, make sure that you're appropriately taking advantage of ministers' housing allowance? Well, let's discuss a few best practices regarding housing allowance. First, be sure that you designate appropriately. For ministers who own a home, remember that housing allowance can only be designated for a minister's primary residence, and it will be the lesser of these three things. First, the amount officially designated as a housing allowance by the church. Second, actual housing expenses. That may include your mortgage payments, utilities, property taxes, insurance, furnishings, repairs, and improvements. Or third, fair market rental value of your furnished home, which includes utilities. But what if a minister rents? Well, then that minister's housing allowance will be lesser of these two things: the amount designated by the church or the actual housing expenses. And this may include your rent, renter's insurance, utilities, furnishings, repairs, and improvements. And ministers living in a rent-free church-provided home may also claim housing allowance as well for expenses like utilities, repairs, furnishings, and other housing expenses not covered by the church. So it's important to note that housing allowance designations must be prospective, meaning that you must designate an estimated amount before incurring the actual expenses. A best practice is to designate housing allowance for both the current and all future years, unless changes are provided. This is known as an evergreen provision. A helpful template for a church to designate ministers' housing allowance is available in the Compensation Planning Guide at guidestone.org/compensation planning. Next, always keep good receipts. Many ministers fail to maintain adequate receipts for housing expenses. In the rare occurrence of an IRS audit, the minister will be responsible for providing documentation of expenses related to housing allowance claim. Therefore, keeping good receipts is essential. And finally, understand your tax liability. The minister's housing allowance may be excluded from income for federal income tax purposes, but not for SECA tax purposes. In other words, a minister's housing allowance excludes gross income for federal income tax purposes, but not for Social Security self-employment tax purposes. By striving to follow appropriate guidelines and best practices, churches and ministers can avoid making many common mistakes when designating the minister's housing allowance. Consider visiting guidestone.org/compensation planning to download a free copy of questions and answers about ministers' housing allowance. Navigating ministerial tax issues can be complicated, but as part of Guidestone's mission to enhance the financial security and the resilience for those who serve the Lord, we've developed resources to make it easier for you. For more information about common tax-related questions and considerations for ministers, please visit guidestone.org or call us Monday through Friday from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Central Time. We look forward to serving you as you serve the Lord.